Okay, so UK energy emissions and targets. If you haven't discovered GridWatch and you're interested in following what happens with UK energy, can I just recommend this to you? You'll find it online, you can get it on your phone, on an app or whatever. But if you want an up-to-the-minute information about what we're consuming at any one point, then this is the place to look. So you can see, this was I think an evening about a week ago, and you can see our demand was about 34, coming up to 35 gigawatts. And you can see coal was actually almost 10%, nuclear over 20, gas almost 60, wind was actually down to less than 3% at the time. So, but you can follow this up to the minute, and it's, you know, if anybody's actually interested in following what's going on, it's very, very interesting. You become a bit addicted, or I do anyway, I become a bit of a geek. So the way I'm going to structure this talk is with the first bit, we're going to just talk about some of the, in fact, I think some of you may find them quite surprising trends in UK energy, but there's definitely some big movements going on in our production and consumption at the moment, and we'll look at those, and we'll look a bit at government policy, how this is perplexing government in some ways, and then we'll look at our emissions. This is the big issue. In the end, it doesn't matter what energy we produce, it's our emissions that count. And we'll look at those and what our targets are. And then in the final bit, we'll look at government policy and kind of what exactly our government is doing at the moment or not doing. So in fact, let's look at some of the trends. Many people don't understand or don't quite get this. You know, as an industrialised country, people believe that our consumption is going up. It's actually been going down. Our primary fuel consumption has been going down for the last 10 years. And with that, we've had some significant drops in greenhouse gases. So there we are. A little bit of good news. There's stories within that, so don't get too excited. But those are the sort of bold headline facts. We also now, of course, have a full commitment to ending our coal-fired power stations. When I say full commitment, only if they're replaced by gas, says the government, sotto voce. Our North Sea is collapsing. We need to understand the implications for our country for this. We are an oil-producing country, a gas-producing country, and at the moment that is going through a major downturn. And good news, we're making significant strides in renewable power, but not, crucially, in our heat or transport. So there we go. So there's some outlining trends. So this is our primary energy consumption. And when I say primary energy, that's the stuff before we turn it into something usable. So it's crude oil before we turn it into petroleum or diesel or anything else. It's coal before we turn it into electricity, gas before we turn it into electricity, though of course we use gas also in its raw form for heating and cooking, but we use a lot of gas to generate steam turbines and generate electricity, and of course nuclear. So this is our, you can see it's going down, and the reason why it's temperature adjusted is because our consumption in our country is very, very weather dependent. And that is because, although we're all very focused on our electricity consumption, our heating is a much bigger issue. And it's much more volatile and much more respondent to the weather, of course. So you can see there with the red line, that's when we had a very cold winter in 2011. And actually we had a very, very mild winter in 2014. And so our consumption actually went down. It's actually gone up a little bit in 2015, though the long-term trend is still down. It's only gone up relevant to the 2014 decline. So that is our primary energy consumption. And if you look at it by actual fuel, so again, so there's oil going down, has been consistently going down, except now our oil, and for oil-read transport, it's going up in response to the low oil price. So we've started using higher consuming vehicles and driving longer mileage. In fact, I think 27% of new car sales last year were SUVs. You know, that's quite an uptick, helped, of course, by our Chancellor taking off the vehicle excise duty on heavy consumption vehicles. But anyway, so we have, after quite a decline, now got a bit of an uptick. Coal, here's the big news, and for 2016, that figure is going to show coal much, much further down. Nuclear bobbing along at the bottom, sort of fairly even Stevens. Renewables coming up, and again, 2016 should show quite an increase when we have those figures. There's gas, which we, as I say, we use for electricity, and we use it as neat gas, you know, in our homes for heating in particular. And that, again, it's on a downward trend, but much more volatile in response to weather. So, and this is where we come to our final energy. One of our main final energy, of course, is electricity. And this just shows how fast things are moving. So this is just between 2 years. Renewables up from 19% to almost 25%. Coal down from 30% to 22%. And again, the 2016 figures are going to show some quite dramatic changes from there. We've doubled the amount of solar since the end of 2015, for example. So, you know, things are moving fast. Whether they're moving fast enough is another issue. But hey, this is quite extraordinary. For the first time this year, first time since 1882, we have been without coal for around 200 hours, without coal-fired power production, which is really quite extraordinary in our history. Our country's built on coal. So you can see for the summer months, we produced more solar, not just renewables, we produced more solar than coal. And if you compare that to the summer before, you can see the difference. So things are really, really changing here. I would just say that that last chart comes from the Carbon Brief. And again, if anybody wants to keep up to date with UK energy issues, the Carbon Brief is a really good digest. You can get it delivered to your mailbox once a week, or you can have a daily digest if you want. But they do a really good in-depth analysis. As I said, Jeremy Leggett also puts out a sort of every couple of months more global analysis of where we are on energy, which is also very useful. And if anybody wants contacts to that, let me know at the end and I'll send them to you. Anyway, so here's our renewable energy use at the end of 2015. And you can see, God, it's very diverse. It's a bit of a mess, you know, for a government that's used to looking at, you know, gas, nuclear, coal, whatever. Suddenly we've got this whole mix of stuff going on, and it's moving very fast. The technology is moving almost, you know, week by week it seems. The prices are changing so very, very dramatically. So, you know, literally the prices for what we pay. This is a very, very moving field, but moving in the right direction. And one thing that I think we should be all very aware of and is that we don't have to substitute 1 megawatt of renewables for 1 megawatt of fossil fuel production. The extraordinary thing is, and it's one very good reason why we should bang the nail in the coffin of fossil fuels, is that we lose about a third of our energy in sourcing energy, in getting energy to us in an acceptable form, which is quite extraordinary. Just within our country, where we're not doing that much actually drilling out of the ground and processing and production and transport of it, we lose, coming up to 27% in losses in transformation, use by energy industries, and losses in distribution. But actually, if you include what the production side that goes outside of our country, about a third of our energy globally is used in getting energy to us. And actually, the extraordinary thing is, if you look at this figure, you can see this is our emissions for the UK. Energy supply is our biggest source of emissions. Okay? So that's really quite extraordinary. It's a really good reason to get off fossil fuels. And in fact, you know, the point is that by cutting our... the good news for you, it means that if you reduce your demand by whatever it is, 1 unit, you actually, in the wider world, have a much bigger ripple effect. You effectively, some estimates, cut it by about 13 units out in the wider world. So it's really, you know, when you wonder whether it matters whether you cut your consumption at home, yes, it does. It really does. You have a much bigger effect than you see on your own power bill, okay? So who is using energy in our country? Where is it all going? Well, if we look at it by, this is final consumption, so this is when it's been turned into usable stuff for us. So here we can see petroleum, almost 50% of our final energy use. Transport is the big one, it's our big challenge. How do we decarbonise this sector, okay? Natural gas, this is gas that's used just as gas for heating or cooking. And then, as you can see, electricity is less than actually 20% of our fuel consumption. We're very focused on it because because basically we've got to get these two sections into that section. Now, there is some leeway for biofuels, biomethane, and other technologies to come in there, but the fastest and clearest way that we're going to get decarbonised these sections is to electrify them. So electrifying your heating, electrifying your transport. Okay, so that is one heck of a challenge, and particularly when you look at the timescale of when we've got to do this. So you may be wondering, okay, domestic sector, what do I do in my home? Am I a big contributor? Domestic sector is about 27%, and then you can add on that part, your section of the transport and so on. So that's where things are in this country. And if you just look at that over time, again, you can see, I suppose quite predictably, that industrial use of energy has come right down. We're a deindustrialising country. Transport, there you can see very clearly how it has been rising till around the mid-2000s, down, but now going back up. Okay. Service sector, which includes agriculture, sort of fairly stable, and the domestic sector wobbling around, much more dependent upon temperature and so on, but generally now, since the mid-2000s, on its way down, okay? Okay, and most of these statistics, again, if you want to get them, the Dukes that the government puts out every year, Digest of UK Energy Statistics, is very readable. And I really would suggest that you just get onto it and read it. Even if you just read the summary, it is, well, I find I'm a bit of a geek, but it's quite fascinating. Okay, so let's look at it. So how does the government look at it? The government looks at it slightly in a more balanced way. What they're interested in is the Energy Trilemma, and you will have heard various government ministers talking about this. So not just the issue about carbon emissions, but also security of energy supply. No government wants to be in power when the lights go off. And if any of you remember the times when we've had petrol shortages and so on, you know, there is that sort of sense of impending anarchy in the country, which I suppose every government wants to avoid. And of course, energy costs. Now, they're very much, of course, focused on energy costs at the home level and the business level, keeping our economy going. But there is, and I'm not going to address that tonight because that's very much about domestic policy and about how the big six energy companies operate and so on, which is really a very domestic issue. But what I am concerned about is what the costs for the country of our import bill, and the government is also obviously very focused on that. So we often don't kind of think about ourselves as quite a big oil producing country or gas producing country, but we have been. In fact, I think in the 1980s we were even invited to join OPEC. We didn't, but there we go. But our production of oil peaked around 2000, and we have been a net importer of oil since around 2004. And I think since about 2009, more and more of our refineries have gone offshore. We're actually importing more and more refined products as well. But remember, so the North Sea is a declining basin. It's a mature basin. It is also a very expensive place to get oil from. We sort of don't think about it, but 200 miles off the Shetland coast, it's a very hostile environment to get oil. It's not an easy job, in fact. And the same goes for our gas. So again, we've been a net importer since about 2004. We've had one major gas field come on stream in 2016, so it won't show up in the figures. But it's quite fascinating, I think, to look at all the pipelines and see where our gas comes in from the North Sea. And the other place that we get gas from, of course, is liquefied natural gas, which we import. This is one of our import facilities at Haverfordwest in West Wales. And liquefied natural gas is where the source country, in order to transport gas, because it's not easy to transport gas, you can't stick it in a barrel, stick it on a ship and all the rest of it, not easily. So they super cool it to a minus 162 degrees. Very, very energy intensive, liquefy it, and then they stick it on a special pressurised, super cooled vessel and ship it thousands of miles. And then when it gets to somewhere like Haverfordwest, they have to regasify it before they put it in the grid. So warm it up again and then stick it in the grid. And most of our LNG at the moment comes from Qatar. But in fact, of course, you will have heard a couple of weeks ago we started our first imports from America, American shale gas coming over as LNG. So in terms of the finances of the country and the money side of things, this is what the government worries about. This is our trade deficit in goods. This is for 2014. Okay, we don't produce much stuff in this country at the moment, and so most of our goods are imported. This is all that going that way because it's all negative, okay? And you can see that oil and other fuels are quite a contributor to that. That has to be balanced. It's balanced mainly by our sale of services. That's why the government loves the banking industry and the insurance industry and so on. We are still in a deficit, of course, a fairly long-term deficit over many, many years, and that has to be balanced with portfolio investment, which is why our government likes selling everything off. I think at the moment we're in the middle of a 20 billion asset disposal to anybody who wants to buy. Met Office is being sold off and God knows what. Anyway, so basically, but this is a bit of a headache for the government. And what they don't want, of course, is to be importing more fuel. So that is a worry, given that, I mean, I could have picked a number of headlines from the beginning of this year. This one is from the Financial Times, 2nd of February. Collapse in crude brings North Sea fields near end of production. So the North Sea this year, with the low oil price, this has precipitated things very, very fast. The North Sea really is collapsing at the moment. Now the government has moved in there, they've cut taxes for the oil industry, they're letting them off decommissioning costs and so on. And it's unclear at the moment what is happening with our production. But at the moment, it looks like it will be very far down. So nearly half of our fields are loss-making. At the moment, this was the prediction at the early part of the year, 50 could close. Very few new wells, very little exploration or new production going on in the North Sea. And worryingly for us, whereas government revenue from oil was 2.2 billion in the previous financial year, the Office of Budget Responsibility is now forecasting 0.9 billion over 6 years. So in terms of taxation and the impact on the country, this is quite a big deal. And remember, we haven't cut our oil usage. Our oil usage is going up. So we've got to find it from somewhere. On top of that, we're of course closing down our coal production. Kellingley was our last deep pit mine, which closed last December. So they are all now closed. We still have quite a few open cast mines. This is Fosse Fran, the biggest in Wales. But our coal output has been really slashed in 2015 and will be more so in 2016. So we are no longer a major coal producer. And if you then think about it in terms of the security issue for which the government is very keen to focus on, and where do we make sure we get secure supplies of energy from? So here's our coal going down, but we are heavily reliant on imports. Most of those will be from Colombia and from Russia. And Russia, since we have sanctions on against Russia at the moment, you know, it's not the happiest of relationships. But hopefully our coal isn't going to be an issue because we are hopefully going to stop using it within a few years. So we won't worry too much about that one. In terms of our oil, we've been heavily reliant on the Norwegian side of the North Sea basin. But of course they share the basin, it's a mature basin. Their production is also going down. And obviously what's happening is that our reliance on OPEC, and for that you can pretty much read the Middle East, is going up. And that is what is expected to happen over the next few years, generally, as high cost production elsewhere around the world is cut while we have low oil prices. We are all going to become more reliant on the Middle East in particular. So it's not something that the government's that thrilled about. In terms of our gas, okay, again, as I say, we've relied heavily on our own production from Norway and from LNG. But again, there is that worry that since much of Europe is much more dependent on Russia for gas than we are, and this is quite a political issue. I'm not going to go into it tonight, but our reliance on Russia and Brussels investigating Gazprom for anti-competition stuff and all this, the whole stuff about the Ukraine and so on. It's quite a political issue, and we'd rather not, presumably, be going there and taking gas from Russia, even indirectly through Europe. So, of course, what our government is keen on is fracking. And I'm not going to go into the many details of fracking, but just a sort of roundup of where we are now, of course. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day news of it all, but we had the mini earthquakes in 2012, which put a moratorium on our fracking, and that now has ended. And so the government is tentatively, well, no, not so tentatively, overruling local authority decisions and giving the go-ahead for fracking. So we've got various wells being given the go-ahead around Blackpool, some test fracking in Yorkshire. Scotland is maintaining a moratorium. I think perhaps the biggest risk here is this guy, it seems to me, Jim Ratcliffe, the multi-billionaire who owns INEOS, a chemical plant up in Scotland. And he, you may have heard him on the radio sort of whinging about our imports of US shale gas. And he has a point, of course. If we're going to import shale gas from America, it probably would be, even in terms of emissions and so on, better to do our own. We have higher standards here. But he certainly is determined to push fracking ahead, and he has very deep pockets. I must admit, I mean, I can't pretend to be an expert in this field, and many of you may know more, followed the fracking thing much more intensively than I have. But the fracking conferences I've been to, the industry generally is saying politicians need to stop running ahead. There is no guarantee, even though we have shale deposits, and we do, that they are commercially viable. And certainly the industry has had to pull out of countries like Poland, and many have pulled out of China, even though there are vast reserves. Sometimes the rocks just do not give the stuff up, and sometimes they do not do it at a commercially viable rate. And one comment I noted in the Financial Times was that we have licensing rounds every couple of years. The round in 2014 was completely underwhelming, and it is really noticeable that the big companies are not in there. And there is no sign of another round of licensing at the moment. They're supposed to be every 2 years. So, I mean, we're all, I think, quite rightly focused on fracking, but how big a threat it will end up being is not entirely clear at the moment. Our committee of, one thing, I've just shoved this slide in because I think this is why we should still be alert to the whole issue about fracking. These are figures from the Committee on Climate Change. We lose around 60,000 gigawatt hours in production of gas generally. And it's interesting to note that there is no figure there for upstream losses. This is losses around the wellhead. This is losses in production. Now that in the US is where most of the methane loss is. And just to go back one step, why are we so worried about methane? Methane is 25 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. It is a real risk, and it's short acting, it's fast, it's powerful. So we, it can have we need to really look at this. But and what they found in the US, where they certainly have not had very tight environmental standards, is that when you first frack, what comes back mainly is frack fluid, but it will have quite a bit of methane in it. But the companies over there have decided it's not economically worthwhile them capturing that first bit of gas, that first bit of methane. They'll just vent that, okay? And that's methane straight up into the air. So, it's very hard to police companies when they are fracking and make sure they don't do that. It's not clear to me how our government would do it, especially since we've cut so many staff from our government departments that oversee this kind of stuff. Anyway, not to get too sidelined, but coal bed methane, there are a couple of technologies that have kind of gone under the radar while everyone's been very focused on fracking. Coal bed methane, which is where you take an old coal seam, you de-water it, you take the water out of it, and the reduction in pressure releases the gas into the seams, and then you take that out. Around 40% of those wells will still end up being fracked, in fact. But, so there have been various proposals to do this. iGas, though, because of the very low price in this country, our gas price has gone down to about a third of what it was a couple of years ago. They have now just recently pulled out of the sites around Chester. So the low oil and gas prices are really having an effect on production, and this is one that possibly will be saved for permanently or for a while, depends on how things go. The other technology that slipped by a lot of people is underground coal gasification. And I'm not going to claim to be an expert on this, but this is where you actually burn the coal underground. And it gives off what they call a syngas, a synthetic gas that comes to the surface, a mixture of carbon monoxide, methane, hydrogen, I think, and you burn it immediately at the wellhead and turn it into electricity. And that is still a possibility of going ahead. It's being sold as a very clean gas, but I can't pretend to know the details, but it doesn't sound terribly clean to me. But in terms of going back to that energy trilemma about cost and security, looking at those two issues, it's worth noting that around 60% of the fuel for our electricity comes from abroad. And we haven't even looked at nuclear, because I'm going to go into that next week. But of course, our uranium comes mainly from Niger and Kazakhstan. So we are dependent on a lot of countries that, by choice we probably wouldn't be. Okay. And you may think, energy trilemma, these three issues, affordability, security of supply, and sustainability, low carbon emissions. There's only one thing that deals with this, renewables. And you're right, it is the only thing. It answers the other questions as well. But there are kind of hurdles in the way. Particularly issues about how they are financed, because the cost is all up front. There are no generation costs. It's quite a different business model to the kind of power stations that we've always had before. So the question is, can renewables meet all our energy needs? Can renewables meet them fast enough? And what are the problems? Why aren't we moving even faster than we are? And the bottom line to this is that we have left this very, very late. If we had started this in the 1990s or even in the 2000s, we wouldn't be where we are now. We're faced with a sort of tricky transition period. We haven't done enough research and development into the batteries, the storage, the interconnectors, all the things that we need to back up our use of renewables. And the technology on renewables is still moving very fast. So we've kind of left this really to the last minute, and now we're probably going to have to pay a bit for the sort of the gap that we've left ourselves. But I think it's really important to note, and this is the message that I want you to go home. The scientists are telling us the next 10 years is critical. What we do in the next 10 years absolutely matters as to whether we stay below 2 degrees or not. And across the industrialised world, we are in kind of a really unusual point where most of our big power stations are about to go offline. Okay, by 2030, I think 2/3 of our current power stations will have gone. So we have some big choices now about how we replace those. And, we'll come on to that. But I want you to really note that we had that point. And it is also confused by the fact that we have a global economic slump at the moment and low oil and gas prices. There are lots of things feeding into this picture. Okay, some of them making renewables look better, some of them making it harder. But there we go. Okay, I think I'm going to call a break there, okay, because that's a lot of statistics. So we'll just have a 5-minute break, and if anybody wants to ask any questions. Okay, so let's look at the third section of the energy trilemma and look at what our emissions are and what our government's aiming for. And let's just remind ourselves as to why, okay? Sorry if this is old news for those of you who've been before or know it anyway. But obviously the aim is to keep below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial times. And the Paris Agreement, we decided that we would try and stay within 1.5 degrees, although, as Amber Rudd said about a week later, that was purely aspirational. But anyway, we are already at about 1 degrees, and I don't think actually many people think that we will stay below 1.5. And in fact, I've already seen articles talking about whether we go above 2. 2 is a movable feast, and we try and get back down below 2. I mean, I think we need to try and keep that as a hard barrier that we do not cross. And nobody thinks that anything is safe about 2 degrees, remember. Life gets pretty rocky even at 2 degrees. So in order to stay there, we've got to peak global emissions no later than 2020 and cut back rapidly from there. Now, the scientists are telling us that we in the OECD countries, the industrialised countries, need to cut back by about 10% a year from there. That is a humongous challenge, but that is what they're saying we need to do. And the G7, of which we are part, has signed up saying that we will aim for total decarbonisation of the world economy by 2100 and pretty much there by 2050. So the death knell has been signed, the death warrant has been signed for the fossil fuel industries. It's really a case of how we put that into practice. And just to remind you, of course, 10 hottest years, and 2016 we've had, I think, 10 consecutively hottest months than we ever had before. So 2016 is likely to be much higher than that. And in the UK we are now facing 2 to 5 extreme or unusual weather events each year. We are like the frogs in the boiling pot of water, as everyone keeps saying. We kind of don't notice it because it happens because we're in the hot water. If somebody threw us in at this temperature, we'd really notice it. And of course, the other perplexing thing is that we have to allow room for the global south to grow. Africa is still only, 3.3% of primary energy fuel. South and Central America, 5.3%. We cannot practically or morally stop them from increasing their consumption. It's up to us to cut. And the good news is that we can. Sorry, I know I say this every week, but just to remind you, at the moment, we are online for a 5 to 6 degree warming by the end of the century, which is no life. So if anybody thinks that this isn't an issue for now, or it is for your children or your grandchildren, it's not. It is an issue for you now. It's an issue for me. I'd like a functioning government, pension system, NHS, and border, and everything else that goes within society, please. So does UK consumption matter? Yes, it does. You might say we're just one small island. We're a relatively small population, and so on. But we're only about 1.55% of the world's consumption. There are some caveats to that. It doesn't include our imported energy, which I will come on to. But the truth is that we are the second highest contributor to the net accumulation of gases. So the gases that are out there now are ones that we put up 100 years ago. We were one of the leaders in the industrialised revolution. We actually have a big moral and practical responsibility. And if you think that doesn't really matter that much, it really mattered at Paris. It was one of the big stumbling blocks to get an international agreement, was how much responsibility we took for the emissions that we have put up in the past. And the truth is we can cut. The estimates vary, but even at the most generous, 50% of emissions are from 10% of the world's population, which is about 730 million, and that will actually include most of us. So we are in the elite of consumers around the world. And although we've all lived with the global south all our lives, and they've been a reality and so on, it's time to get real, actually. And we have this major strength that as a major market, we in the industrialised world can change the economics. It's only by changing the economics of the energy world that we will change the physical structure and make strides to move ahead towards a cleaner future. And it's perfectly possible for us to do that. Anyway, enough proselytising. The UK actually has some things it can be proud of. We signed up to the Kyoto Agreement in the 1990s when, of course, the US and China didn't. It was the first international agreement on carbon emission reduction, and we set ourselves commitment periods, and we are still in those, but they've been superseded by other pieces of legislation and agreements since. And the major piece of legislation is the Climate Change Act from 2008, led through by Ed Miliband. And this was a really groundbreaking piece of legislation. In fact, I'm not actually sure if any other country has done it, but we have set ourselves legally binding targets. And the point is that we have to have 3 carbon budgets ahead legislated. So in fact, in June this year, we legislated for the budget 2027 to 2032. So we have to have those budgets legislated for in advance. And what we have agreed is a 35% reduction from 1990 levels. Okay, so we're not talking going back to pre-industrial times, we're talking quite a generous starting point. But 35% reduction by 2020, 80% by 2050, with an interim target of 50% by 2025. Okay, and the last one that we've just agreed is a 57% cut by 2032. That has now gone through Parliament, and we're waiting for the government to make their statements about how that is going to be implemented, how we're going to get there. So there we are. And if you look at the budgets pictorially, so the black lines there are the actual carbon budgets. That is how much carbon we can emit during those 5-year periods. 4-year periods. And the blue line is actually what we're expected to do or what we have done. So the first one we made easily, second one we are going to make easily, in fact we're ahead of target. Third one we will make, fourth one at the moment we will not, and fifth one we will not. And the reason for that is because we are making no progress on heating and on transport, and our government has kind of pulled the rug from renewables, but we'll come on to that. But really the big issues are our heating and our transport. So now, okay, our wonderful figures that we like to be so proud of. Just remember, our emissions do not include our international aviation. And that, of course, is a big and growing issue. And remember, every time you fly, I hate to say it, but every time you fly, the emissions that you put out have what they call a radiative forcing, which makes them much more dangerous than if you just put out those emissions down on the ground. Flying really is a pretty catastrophic thing to do. So sorry, folks. International shipping, of course, we use the worst fuel. We use bunker fuel. It's the absolute dregs from the refining process. And remember, a third of our shipping is actually bringing oil around the world. So, so there is one easy way to cut our shipping, which is to cut our oil consumption. But there we go. Anyway, those are not included on our emission targets, nor is our embedded energy. And this is a really big issue because we are a deindustrialised country. So where we may like to sort of think we're doing so well with our reducing energy consumption, our reducing emissions, actually an awful lot of it is just being offshored. We're just, it's all those other countries that are making stuff for us. They put it on their bill, their carbon bill, we import it, okay? So serious issues. And that, in fact, I think Dieter Helm estimates that embedded energy probably doubles the consumption of every one of us. So when you think about it's the things you consume, not just your energy source, okay? So anyway, but here's the happy picture, okay? So you can see these are our declines and a kind of rapid decline at the moment, and most of that comes from our energy sector, the fact that we are getting rid of coal. Coal is so dirty. And so with the reduction of coal, our emissions are declining much faster, and 2016 should show some good figures on there. But look, wonderful, we're ahead of our 35% target already for 2020. So that's good news, but as I say, we're not on target for our 4th or 5th budget. And just to look at that over time, okay, so you can see, again, the fantastic news. It's our power industry, it's our electricity generation that is reducing our emissions. Look at that dramatic drop. That is because of our getting rid of coal and moving on to renewables. Transport, you can see actually our emissions are starting to go up from transport again. That's to do with the low oil price and all the other parts of our economy. You can see how they're sort of rumbling along. Industry going down, of course, for obvious reasons. Okay, and I would just say, again, if you want, can we leave questions to the end, if that's okay? If you want to source on this, and again, it's very, very readable, and I really would suggest part of the Climate Change Act was setting up the Committee on Climate Change, and it is their job. It's led by John Gummer, if anybody remembers him, he who stuffed hamburgers into his daughter's mouth when we had BSE and so on. So only people of a certain age will remember that. But anyway, he is chair of the committee, and you know, it's really it's very readable, and they put together a very critical report of where our government is succeeding and failing on meeting our carbon budgets. So the key findings that they've come up with is that we need to cut by around 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. That means across all the spectrum of greenhouse gases, 2 to 3% every year. Now this is what they're saying to meet the UK targets. It's not what the scientists are saying. The scientists are saying we actually need to cut much faster than this, but this is probably about as good as we're going to get. And again, of course, the key obstacles, the low uptake of low carbon technology in buildings, increased vehicle use has offset all the improvements we have in vehicle efficiency. We're not making much progress in agriculture or industrial sectors. Okay, and I have to say, Brexit complicates things. Nobody's quite clear at the moment, but the EU had a whole raft of legislation and requirements, things on F-gases, efficiency, waste, and so on, which we don't know at the moment whether we're still going to be part of or not, whether we're still bound by those. And people like Nigel Lawson are already saying that we need to challenge the legality, the legal status of the Climate Change Act. So it's certainly under threat, but there is generally, from what I understand, a fairly good cross-party consensus in favour of keeping the Climate Change Act and keeping those targets in place. But if you should read differently, sign those petitions and send them off. Okay. Now, one of the worrying things to me it is worrying, with the Committee of Climate Change, their projections are very much based on us developing more nuclear and on developing carbon capture and storage. And the only way they think that we're going to get to our 4th and 5th carbon targets is very much in developing those. So you can see they've built in here more renewables, yes, but also from 2021, carbon capture and storage. Well, that isn't going to happen. The government pulled the funding on all exploratory tests on that last year, and that was after years of not being able to make it work financially. And of course on nuclear from 2025. Well, 2025 is looking incredibly hopeful, even if Hinkley got going tomorrow. You know, they started work on the actual building tomorrow. So, but I'm not going to go down the line of too much nuclear tonight, because next week's talk is all about nuclear, about UK nuclear. So, you know, I'm not going to touch too much on that at the moment. The things that they're complimentary about our government doing is they've extended the funding for offshore wind, they've put in some more renewable heat funding, and electric cars, you can still get a grant on those till 2018 now. Okay, but the committee is very critical of our government on the carbon capture and storage, on the lack of the very sudden withdrawal of help for most of our other renewable energy, no action on low carbon heat. I mean, the amount of insulation, loft insulation and wall insulation that has just fallen away since around 2012. We were doing really well, but it's almost come to a halt now with the end of Green Deal and various other initiatives. So, you know, these are really fast-acting things that you don't have to wait to build a power station. You know, you just insulate a few houses and you can help cut our consumption. It's very fast-acting. And we have no vehicle efficiency standards, but we need a 43% drop in emissions by 2030. So there we go. So they are very critical of the government on many things. Now, I'm not going to go too deeply into European targets. What I've agreed with the Bristol Energy Co-op and our kind filmmakers is that the stuff on European targets, mainly I'm going to put in slides at the bottom of the talk, so you can access those online. But just to note that Europe has given us targets on much wider things, on renewables. We don't have our own target on that, but also on efficiency and on vehicle fuel and so on. So I won't go into too many details of that, but just to note that we are below the European average on our renewable generation. I don't know if you can see that figure there. We're about 25% at the moment. Denmark 58%, Sweden 57%, Spain 41%, European average 29%. So we're just slightly below average across Europe. And in terms of agreements on emissions and so on, of course, Paris last December, the big one. But what Paris did, and it was, the plus side of Paris was that all our governments signed up to say, yes, this is important, yes, this is a priority, and we need to act fast, and we need to help the global south move. So there were lots of pluses that came out of it, but in terms of actual practical agreement, every country was asked. In order to get that international agreement, nobody was forced to say they would commit to a certain amount. What they were asked to do was put forward pledges, and our pledges are pretty much in line with our Climate Change Act. But that has now been... So anyway, those pledges together bring us close to 3 degrees. We do not want to go there. We need to be much lower than the Paris Agreement gets us to. But the good news is, and really quite shockingly, because nobody expected it to be ratified so quickly, and the reason is Trump, it needed 55% of 55 countries to ratify it with at least 55% of emissions. And we had 74 countries ratified, but the worry was that the EU hadn't ratified it. We haven't ratified it yet. The EU is about 12% of world emissions. And so really everybody wanted to get this through before there was the risk of Trump taking over the presidency. Okay, so the EU has suddenly, really quite suddenly, said, fine, we'll ratify it on behalf of the whole EU. Okay, countries like France and Germany have ratified it. I don't know why our government has. I guess they've been thinking about other things like Brexit and whatever. But the good news is, I mean, Trump has pledged that he will repeal it and so on. But if once now it's in force, even if he repeals it on day one, America can't leave for 4 years, so they are bound by it for 4 years. So that is the good news. And it's now up to the ratified countries. They've got their first meeting, I think, in Marrakesh, I think it's next month. And nobody expected to have to be dealing with the practicalities quite so quickly. They thought it would take a couple of years to sort of bed down. But they're now having to think about how they start supporting the Global South and about adaptation plans and so on. So everything's moving quite fast on that. Anyway, here's just the summary of our targets, just so that, you know, if when you go home and you're completely confused about, okay, what the hell are our targets, what have we signed up to, look at this slide, and this sort of covers it. We're going to make the first greenhouse gas emissions. Whether we make the 50% by 2025 is debatable. We are certainly not going to make 15% of all fuel, which includes heating and transport, by 2020. I think at the moment we're about 8.3%. And on road vehicle stuff, we're making very little progress. So these are our failings, okay? And just to put it visually, this is what we've got to get into this by 2050. This is our target. So you can see power at the top. Power production is our major source of emission. Next comes surface transport. For that, read road and rail, but mainly road. Buildings next, and so on. So you can see the major challenges, and we have got to condense that into that. So quite a task ahead. Okay, so the question is, of course, why are we not moving faster towards renewables? You know, they seem to meet the 3 bits of the Energy Trilemma. And of course, first of all, it would be true to say that our government has shifted its focus when it comes to security of supply. Instead of thinking about, well, all those horrible countries that we have to import stuff from, they're more worried now about security within the UK and whether there's a risk that the lights go out at any point. And as I say, we've left it very late to develop those systems around new renewables, and I'll come on and talk about that a bit more. And you'll hear, I don't know why, but the government, it's infuriating. They keep talking about, well, we need a mix. And it sounds so reassuring. It's like listening to Mother, you know, if any of you remember those stories, or that programme. But it's kind of, it all sounds so right, doesn't it? Of course we need a mix, that'll keep us safe. But no, we do not need a mix that involves coal, hydrocarbons. I will explain the reasons next week, do not think we need a mix that involves nuclear. The government is focused on this idea of baseload. We need baseload. We need a regular supply of electricity that doesn't go away. We can just rely on it to be there any other time, and then we'll deal with the ups and downs. Basically, the government is still very much focused on supply. Basically, you go and consume what you want, and the government and industry, one way or another, will make sure there is electricity and there is fuel there so you don't run out. Okay, you don't need to worry your pretty little heads, darlings. Okay, that's how it feels like to me. But the world is changing. The world is changing, and I'll come on to that. It's becoming a much more complex picture. And in fact, industry and the national grid are very much geared up for this change, whereas the government still seems to have been left behind on this argument. There is a very genuine argument about the upfront costs. Okay, it's a different business model. Renewables don't have generation costs generally. Once you put in the solar, you don't have to pay much more. You've got some insurance and maintenance or whatever, same with wind and so on. But it's not the same as running a gas station or a nuclear power station and so on. And so there are implications about how that happens and implications for the grid, because the more we take off the national grid, the more we have smaller grids, but we rely on the national grid as backup, we need to make sure the national grid is still funded. So, for example, when you have a solar panel on your roof and you rely on that more and more for your generation, you may think, hey, I don't need the national grid, apart from, that 10% in winter or whatever it is. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but somehow or other, you still need the national grid to be there, you need it funded, but you won't be contributing to it when you are just auto-generating at home. So it's just a case of finding a different way of financing these things and so on, and that's not beyond the wit of man. Okay, so now this is what is scaring government, okay? This is a list of our power stations that have closed since 2011, and in fact that's not all of them. Rugley went off this year as well, and Eggborough went off for a while, though I think it's been paid to come back on this winter. So we have a net loss of around 22 gigawatts of capacity during this period. And we have more to go offline, especially if all our coal goes off. So we are facing the closure of a lot more. And of course, all our nuclear is getting very old. In 2014, we had quite a crisis at the end of the year when some of our nuclear plants broke down. We can't rely on them. Some of these have had life extensions, but it's not great when they are old plants. And generally, they are all coming to the end of their lives. Now, the government is looking forward, as it should, and thinking, well, hey, in 10 years' time, we're going to have largely electrified our heating and our transport. We're going to need a whopping great lot more electricity generation. And if you're wondering why the government is keen on Hinkley, that is the reason, okay? They want that base load to meet what they expect to be a much higher demand for electricity in about 10 years. So this is the changing position. So we have just over 80 gigawatts of capacity in the country at any time, but less and less of that is being produced by what they call the major power producers. In fact, it's only about 71 gigawatts now, and it's going down quite fast. So you can understand it, I suppose, from some ways. The government likes to think, there's all these major producers out there that I can call on, or the industry can call on at any time to start generating as needed. But the world has got a sort of slightly messier place than that. And this is really what they're focused on, and this affects you. The big deal is what you do between 4 and 8 o'clock on a winter's night, okay? This is our peak consumption. And when you go home and you leave the printer on at work and the computer's on at work, and you go home and you turn on everything at home and you start vacuuming and all the rest of it, you push our consumption up for a very short period. For just a few hours on a winter's night, we hit quite a peak. And in fact, that peak has been coming down. We have been levelling it off. In fact, it came down, I think, 2.1% down last year. It has been levelling because of various measures. But this is what the government is worried about. They do not want the lights to go out. And so what they want is to know that we have got capacity, reliable capacity, way above that peak. And again, if you look at GridWatch any time, it's useful. This was an October night about a week ago. Our demand was around 39 gigawatts. Our peak demand last winter, was 52 gigawatts. That's 50. A megawatt is 1,000. Sorry, a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. So that's 52 gigawatts, 0.735. Okay. So, and as I say, our capacity in the country is around 80 gigawatts. And last winter we had the first time of. We weren't near to a blackout, but it was the first time that the National Grid did have to call on the first stage, put in the sort of first emergency warning. This was last November, that things were getting close. Okay, we were not near a blackout, but it's quite a sign of things to come, I suppose, or the potential. So the government is very much focused on building new power plants, nuclear, of course, and gas. And again, as I say, I'll go into this next week. Gas-fired, we're not so badly off with our gas-fired power plants. They're generally a little bit newer than our nuclear or our coal, but the government sees this as a clean fuel. Now, every time they say that, do spit at them, because it's not a clean fuel. You know, you will have heard me talk about this last week, some of you, but you know, it takes a lot of energy to get gas out of the ground, to clean it, to transport it, and so on. It is not a clean energy. The only thing it's cleaner at is at the power station. If you burn gas or you burn coal at the power station, you'd rather burn gas. Coal is very dirty at that point. But when you look at the whole life cycle of production and transport and everything else and processing of the fuel, then gas is not a clean fuel. So there we go. But the government is having real trouble incentivizing new gas. I mean, they're having trouble incentivizing new nuclear, but certainly gas. And we have a couple of living examples on our doorstep. At Avonmouth, this is Seabank 3, which was all planned, ready to go by SSE. And in 2014, it just got pulled. Same with Avon Power, Scottish Power plant, pretty much planned, ready to go, got pulled. Now the government is having real trouble incentivising new gas plant, and the reason is it's because of our electricity prices and because of our declining consumption. It doesn't look good. If you want to, you've got to think about building this plant, going through all the processes and all the rest of it, building it. You want to know you've got a guaranteed profit for the next 20, 30 years, and that is not looking clear to the industry. And part of that is because of renewables, because when we produce renewable electricity, it's almost no cost. All the costs were up front. So it actually reduces our prices. So what is the government doing? They are trying to, to cover that possible gap, the possible risk of lights going out and so on. They've set up a new system for paying for capacity, and it's called capacity auctions. They're not open to renewables, and the point is what they're doing is paying plants to sit there as capacity. They don't have to, they're not being paid for their actual generation, they're being paid to be there, to come online if they are needed. The Committee on Climate Change is fairly relaxed about this because they don't believe it'll be used much. I mean, I think it's more worrying for us. You probably know that we've been under threat in Bristol from 3 of these, 2 of them diesel powered, incredibly dirty, banks of diesel generators, and 1 gas. And interestingly, all sited in the poorest parts of Bristol, you know, St Philip's, St Werburgh's, Horfield, and so on. At the moment, the local communities there have got themselves very organised and push those away, but it's taken a lot of effort, and 1 company has come back with new plans, which I think at the moment are on hold. But anyway, the capacity auctions are there, and you might, you know, people have been very critical of it, but one way or another, we do have to manage this difficult transition period we have. So, you know, people have mixed feelings about it, but diesel is really not a good way to go. And National Grid has this year issued various contracts to some of our coal-fired power plants. So most of them have been offline all summer. They've now been given contracts to sit there and be ready to come back in winter as necessary. And as I think I showed you right at the beginning, we're at about 9% of, we are using coal again now that we're getting into the colder period. There we go. But remember, it takes about 4 hours minimum to get a coal-fired power plant up and moving again. It takes much longer to get nuclear moving. Gas can be fairly quick. Gas with the new turbines can get moving within about half an hour. So there we go. But basically, I think this is really interesting. So while the government is very much focused on building new big plants and so on around the country, this is the CEO of the National Grid saying the focus on baseload is outdated. From a consumer's point of view, the solar on the rooftop is going to be the baseload. Centralised power stations will increasingly be used to provide peak demand, so just to hit the extra bits that we need. By 2020, small-scale distribution will represent a third of capacity in the UK, okay? So it's a very, very changed world. So instead of focusing just on supply, and the idea is that supply has to meet your every demand, every need, the idea is now that actually we look at it the other way. We look much more about how flexible we can make demand to meet supply. So the question is, do we go down that route of more conventional safety stuff, which the government likes, or a change in structure? And the change in structure is going to involve more diverse renewables, efficiency measures, which are very fast acting, load shifting, so getting you to move your peak demand. Do not come home on a winter's night and turn your dishwasher on, your washing machine, and do your vacuuming. Leave it till later, leave it to the weekend, okay? And of course, what they're going to do is bring in financial incentives for you to do that. Demand side response, we'll come on to that in a minute, interconnectors, storage, and capacity auctions, as we've discussed. Okay, but in terms of actually incentivising new renewables, as you know, the government slashed the subsidies last year and the helps for that. They do have these things called contracts for difference, but they are very heavily hamstrung by the levy control framework, which was set up before the drop in oil prices. And this provides a fixed pot of 7.6 billion per year to spend on the difference between, I don't want to get too technical, but the difference between the wholesale price and the strike price, the agreed price that they will pay for renewable generation. And because the gas price and the oil price has lowered, and for various other reasons, that pot has been emptied much, much faster than anyone anticipated. Not helped by, well, some government policies as well. I won't go into too much details, but please ask me in the break. Now, I know some of you are going to tell me that these figures are already out of date. This is what was in the Committee for Climate Change report on the costs now for installing some of our major renewable systems. But I'm told this evening, in fact, that offshore wind is now down to around 65 euros. So the prices are tumbling very, very fast. This is such a moving scene. And I've just added this one in because in fact it hardly figures at the moment, but tidal generation is a big possibility, and the Major project has just been launched this year up in Scotland. The prospects are, this is not barrage tidal, this is turbines that sit weighted on the sea floor. There's some off St David's, there's some down in the Channel, and these are possibly going to generate around 12% of the UK's energy. So they have big potential. But anyway, I suppose what that illustrates is that there are all new technologies coming on very fast at the moment, and who knows what's going to be the winner and what's going to be the dominant ones. Just to, on that pricing issue, of course, many of you who've quickly done the maths in your head may have worked out that, of course, we now have more renewable capacity. In fact, I think it's closer to 30 gigawatts now because of the strides we've made this year. 30 gigawatts of capacity, and yet in summer, our demand is actually lower than that. And so for this year, for the first time, we've had some prices turn negative. We're actually producing more electricity than we need. And so that's a bit of a temporary headache. It is a temporary one because we're certainly going to need that capacity. And of course we have other solutions of what to do with it. We have interconnectors. Now this is another good thing that Europe has made us do. By 2020 we are supposed to have 10%, each European country is supposed to have 10% interconnection. So we can import and export energy across borders. And if you look on that GridWatch website, you'll see we have 4 up and running at the moment. We have a French one, which we tap into nuclear, and then at different times of year we send them stuff. This is the Dutch one is mainly wind from North Europe, their excess wind they export to us. We have one between Scotland and Northern Ireland and one between Wales and the Irish Republic. But in fact we have many more of these planned. We have about another 6 definitely about to happen, which will bring us around another 6 gigawatts of capacity. One through the channel link, the tunnel link. So obvious, isn't it? You can just put an electricity cable in there, an extra one. And that's on track. I think that's about to happen, in fact. The one that is more dodgy at the moment is the Norwegian. You may have heard of the possibility of our tapping into Icelandic geothermal energy, and this big one. The Icelandic people, probably very sensibly, are a little bit reluctant on this at the moment. It's a bit contentious because they're going to have to rip up quite a bit of their countryside. And as I heard one of them say, why should we do that when British people won't turn their TVs off standby? Why should we lose our countryside for this? Good point, I think. Interesting to see. This one, it's very faint, but you may be able to see it better on the video. But those red lines are existing interconnectors around Europe. So we have quite a lot going on around Europe at the moment, and of course the potential is for ones going across to Africa as well. So there's lots going on in that movement. And of course the idea is that if the wind is not blowing off the west coast of the UK, it probably is blowing off the coast of Germany or Italy, or we can tap into Norwegian hydroelectric and so on. So the idea is that Europe becomes much more of an interconnected electricity market. And of course, the big thing that we need with renewables is batteries, because we don't want to throw away energy when we don't need it. We want to save it for when we do. And here's just a selection of headlines from the FT this year, just very recent ones, in fact. But this year in particular, the last couple of years, there's been massive investments into new battery technology in all sorts of different ways. The batteries come in all different forms. These are our traditional ones. We've got about 4 of these in the country. I don't know if anybody's been to Dinorwig, but I went in summer to the one in Wales. And this is Cruachan, I'm probably pronouncing that very badly, in Scotland. But the idea is that it's a hydroelectric scheme, and when we have very little demand for electricity in the nighttime, they use that to pump the water to the top, and it sits there until we need it. So there's a sudden need for it, and then they let it out, and within a few seconds they can whop a load of electricity onto the grid. And we've got 4 of those, and the idea is that this one, I think, the suggestion is that is expanded. But there are many other things. Grid scale batteries. This is Kilroot in Northern Ireland, a major power station. They've put in a massive supply of lithium, I think, ion batteries. They think it'll save them millions of pounds a year to do now that they've done it. Sodium ion. Lithium, of course, is great because it's so light and energy dense. That's why you use it in your computers and all the rest of it. For grid scale, you probably don't need something quite so light. Sodium ion is better. You can now get, of course, Tesla and Powervault and all the rest of it are doing batteries that you can put in your home. This is a UK manufactured one. You can put it on top of your kitchen, on top of your fridge to get the power from your solar panels and store it and then use it whenever you need it at peak time and so on. We have flywheel, compressed air, all sorts of different methods of saving the electricity that we're not using when we're generating too much, usually at night, because our demand is fairly predictable. Turning it into hydrogen or ammonia is another alternative. So there are lots of alternatives of what we do with spare electricity and how we even out the demand and supply. And of course, load shifting. So this idea that you now have to, you're going to be persuaded to take demand off your peak period. So we're all in line to get smart meters. I think the idea is 53 million smart meters by 2020, but I think only 2 million meters have been rolled out so far. So we've got a long way to go. And I'm not entirely sure, maybe some of you are, as to why that is so slow. I've asked the question, but I've never had a good answer on that. but yes, there is a question about whether we literally pay people to stop using at certain times and whether that would be cheaper than building new power stations. With these, I think one of the questions is, will we react to price? The point is about our energy consumption, it's become behavioural. It's become a cultural thing. We don't think about turning a light off as we go out of the room. I mean, I think, look, I won't ask, but just think at home and think about how many appliances you've left on standby. Your microwave, your washing machine, your TV, your computer, they are all still consuming electricity. And you haven't even thought, most of you, about turning them off. So, you know, it's become, we don't even look at our electricity bills. Most of us get our electricity bills every 3 months or so, and you know, it's completely divorced from our actual usage. The idea of a smart meter is that you understand what you are consuming now, and hopefully that will change your consumption patterns. The point is, for those who really are in energy poverty, it could just utterly depress them. You know, I mean, if you can't reduce your energy consumption anymore, that's pretty bad news. Do you want to have it flagged up how much you're using? But there we go. Anyway, so it's an exciting new world with the idea of lots of, you know, we will be able to sell our electricity back to the grid. You store it in your batteries, you can sell it back to the grid at different times and so on. So all very exciting. And just the really good news, this is Lord Adonis, who came up with the National Infrastructure Report just a couple of months ago. The point is, and there are other reports on saying exactly the same thing, another European report saying, this is not a cost to our country. Renewables, there may be an upfront cost, but what we reduce in our imports, it completely pays for them. And that's true across Europe. You know, this is not the massive financial hurdle. It's just a different way of accounting and looking at things. So we have to find our ways around that. Okay, so that's pretty much it. But the point is, what I want to say is it really is up to us. As you know, we kind of forget that we are at the heart of the economy. We are the consumers. What you do, what you consume, you may think it's not seen, but there are bean counters in every industry who are watching what you consume and whether your trend is up, down, or whatever. And basically, remember, we have two very different projections going on. The oil majors are saying by 2040 we will still be more than 80% dependent on fossil fuels. We have the IEA saying by 2030, a quarter of all our energy across the globe will come from renewable sources. Now, you know, it really is up to us, particularly in the global north, to decide which of those is true. And I usually don't, at the end of all these talks, I'm usually asked what I should do. And so I've slipped this one in to the end of the lecture. Okay. But only to preempt you asking me. So there we are. There's my personal hit list on what you need to do. Anyway, but thank you very much, and I hope that's been useful.